Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will you call the House to order?
House will come to order. Mr. Morelli?
Yes, sir. Members have on their desks a D as in done calendar. I now move that we advance the D calendar.
On Mr. Morelli's motion, the D calendar is advanced. Mr. Morelli?
Yes, sir. If we could take up Rules Report 557, Committee on Rules by Mr. Farrell, which is on page 3 of that D calendar.
On a motion by Mr. Farrell, the Senate bill is before the House. The Senate bill is advanced. Governor's message is at the desk. Clerk will read the message.
I hereby certify to an immediate vote. Andrew M. Cuomo, Governor.
Mr. Ra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will Mr. Farrell yield for a question, or a couple questions, actually?
No.
I'm sorry.
Not again.
Chairwoman Nolan, just a few questions on the education portion.
Ms. Nolan, will you yield?
Yes, I drew the short straw, yes.
Yes, he did. Ms. Nolan will
Thank you
yield.
very much. So, just two different questions. One dealing with this little piece related to APPR. So, my understanding is that this bill here makes an amendment to when APPR plans are to be adopted. I know it just changes September 1st to December 31st. I'm just wondering, does the plan have to be fully adopted, implemented by that time? Because obviously we're looking at a date that is now the middle of a school year as opposed to the beginning of a school year.
As you may remember, and as you mentioned, our enacted budget of just a few months ago did require the districts to have their teacher and principal evaluation plans approved by state ed by September 1st. And, you know, many of us in the legislature, all of us really, objected strenuously to an idea that they might lose a state aid increase. I really don't know a member of the legislature that thought it was a good idea, but we're not the only parties to this agreement, and the executive felt strongly and continues to feel strongly that schools that do not have a plan approved should lose their increase. In the spirit of cooperation, I want to thank Speaker Hasty very, very much for continuing to keep this issue alive and acknowledge the role that Lita Flanagan played. And so we have moved the deadline for the APPR plans to December 31st, 2016, allowing things to move forward. And there are 100 districts or so that have plans approved right now out of the 700, and hopefully by December, almost all of the 700 will be able to move forward. And then we'll deal with it when we come back, which will be the 8th time in 7 years we're dealing with the same subject, but that's the legislature. So.
Yes. And so those districts that don't have a plan approved, that means they already have a hardship waiver, so they will be eligible for this new deadline, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. And then one other question on the SUNY charter school authorization portion,
Yes.
which I believe is Part P. Just quickly, so I guess my understanding is there are some charter schools that are governed by SUNY and some that are governed under the State Education Department.
Correct.
And this would allow charter schools at their option to apply to be governed by the state by the SUNY board.
In 1998, we created 3 authorizers: the State Education Department, the State University, and the City of New York. The bill would allow charter schools in the just in the City of New York or throughout the system. I'm double checking. Yes, throughout the state, actually, which is interesting, has a larger reach, but it would allow the charter schools that, by the way, have to be in good standing, because if you've been evaluated poorly, you should not have the choice to move. But if you're running a good operation and you feel you want to change your authorizer to the State Education Department or the SUNY Board of Trustees Charter Institute, you may do that. If you're in the City of New York, you can also decide to go with the City of New York if you were chartered by the other 2.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chairwoman Nolan, and for all your work this year on the Education Committee. It's been a pleasure. Mr. Speaker, briefly on the bill.
On the bill, Mr. Roth.
Just quickly, and I know, as Chairwoman Nolan mentioned, it's not really this House. We know exactly who's the one that wants this deadline to stand as firm as possible. But it truly is a shame that as the State Education Department has targeted 2019 to do another new teacher evaluation system, that we're going to keep the pressure on our districts to implement something, to come up with something, to negotiate with their collective bargaining units, something that we're going to change once again. This is something that I guess if anybody likes the Peanuts cartoons, they'd be proud of this, as the football gets pulled away from the schools once again. We'll have yet another iteration coming in the future. So it is a shame that we're doing this, but I know that there was some very strong leadership from many on both sides of the aisle in this House pushing to put that deadline on, and I thank everybody for keeping that issue on the forefront of their mind. I have my other concerns with other parts of this bill, but we will continue to discuss this topic, I'm sure, in the future and in the next legislative session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ram. Mr. Goodell.
Thank you, Leader. Would the sponsor yield?
Mr. Farrell, will you yield?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Farrell yields.
Thank you, Mr. Farrell. I was looking at Part Q of this bill, which deals with the mortgage foreclosure process. And my recollection is that this is new, that it wasn't in the original budget documents that we received from the governor or that we voted on back in April. Is that correct?
I will sit down and let Ms. Weinstein answer that question for you.
I'm sorry, Mr. Goodell, could you...
The Part Q that's in this
Right.
budget cleanup bill, am I correct that these provisions were not included in the original budget bill?
Correct.
And is there any appropriation in this cleanup bill that relates in any way to these mortgage foreclosure procedures?
No.
If there's no appropriation at all that relates to it, then my question is, how can we have it in a budget bill since the Article 7 language contained in Article 7, Section 6 says no provision shall be embraced in any appropriation bill or in any supplemental appropriation bill, that's what this would be, a supplemental appropriation bill, unless it relates specifically to some particular appropriation in the bill. And any such provision shall be limited in its operation to such appropriation. So my question is, why is this in an appropriation bill?
I think I'm going to be throwing that back to our chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, who has the Ways and Means staff there who could help address this issue.
Thank you, Ms. Weinstein, and thank you, Mr. Farrell.
Bill has many pieces to it. It does both things, what you say and what we don't do, and we did it in one set, and that we can do. And there is money already in that we did when we did the budget back in April and March.
I'm aware that it's 4:30 in the morning, and I apologize if I had a little bit of trouble following that, so maybe I can break it down a little bit. Is there any appropriation in the supplemental
No,
budget
it is
bill that
not.
relates to this?
But we have done appropriations in the past, and that will carry it in because we're putting this up against that money. So it will be there.
As you know, I always appreciate your responses. Thank you, Mr. Farrell.
My pleasure.
Would Ms. Weinstein yield again?
Ms. Weinstein, will you yield?
Sure.
Ms. Weinstein yields.
I just want to review on the mortgage foreclosure process some of the time frames so that I understand them. As I understand this, we now impose on a bank an inspection requirement that commences upon delinquency of the mortgage. Is that correct?
90-day delinquency, yes.
Well, I think the language actually says during the 90 days, starting with the delinquency. Is that correct?
The inspection after 90 days of delinquency, that's when the obligation to inspect begins. You know, it is 4:30 in the morning.
I apologize because I got this at about 2 in the morning, and my ability to read even at that point, that early hour was somewhat limited. So a person is in delinquency. We can't begin the foreclosure process for 90 days. Is that correct? They have to be 90 days in delinquency before we file someone's complaint.
You know, the proposal has different aspects to it. I think the aspect that you're most interested in has to do with the expedited process procedure that we've set up for properties that are vacant and abandoned, which has a much shorter time frame.
I see. Okay. So the obligation to begin the inspection begins, quote, within 90 days of the borrower's delinquency. And then they have to inspect it for at least 3 months following that. So we're now 180 days out. And if after 180 days the bank determines that the property may be abandoned, then they can apply to the court for an expedited procedure. Correct?
See, Mr. Goodell, I think what you're mixing up is the maintenance requirement that follows the time frame you spoke about. But if the lender is looking to actually foreclose on the property, they can on 7 days. They can post a notice that says if they believe it to be vacant and abandoned under the criteria set forth in this statute that we're hopefully will adopt momentarily, they can post a notice saying that the property is vacant and abandoned. It's a 7-day notice, and they could then proceed under the expedited process. So the time frame of the 90 days, the 3 inspections, that has to do with the requirement for maintenance of the property. But if they're actually looking to foreclose on a property they believe is vacant and abandoned, it's a very different time frame.
Thank you, Ms. Weinstein. I know all of our colleagues are just excited about the possibility that you and I could delve into the details on this process.
I think they're more excited to see this bill actually function and go after zombies before sunrise, actually, because that's the best time to get zombies.
Indeed, not just them, but all of us. One other question. This bill says that it's to take effect in 120 days after adoption, I believe.
Yes.
And in it, it has provisions that suspend the bank's ability to collect interest if a court, for example, determines they're not negotiating in good faith.
Correct.
And a suspension of interest would be inconsistent with presumably with their note, because I'm not aware of any bank note that allows for a suspension of interest. Would that be correct?
I don't know about the note, but we change. I believe at times that in fact this is a penalty that can be imposed. What we do is we provide that the plaintiff and the defendant has to act in good faith at the settlement conference to try and get to a resolution that helps actually the homeowners stay, whether through loan modification, some other means, be able to stay in the home. And if the plaintiff is not acting in good faith, one of the penalties that can right away be imposed is the tolling of the interest and penalties.
And how is that consistent with the provisions in the United States Constitution under Article 3, Section 10C, that provides that no state shall pass any law impairing the obligation of a contract? Doesn't this impair the obligation of an existing contract?
Perhaps on Monday we could have a phone conversation. I'll pull out my Constitution and we could figure that one out.
I would look forward to that. Just this Monday, thank you very much, Ms. Weinstein.
Sure.
Just this Monday, I got up at 4:40 a.m. and drove to Albany, and I was so pleased to see such a beautiful sunrise, and I wanted to share that pleasure with all of you this morning. So I know you're all thankful. So the concerns that I have is that a few years back, we took a fairly smooth, long-standing mortgage foreclosure process, and we started adding a whole bunch of additional procedures in it. Mandatory settlement conferences, which added, it turns out, about 270 days to the foreclosure process. Additional notice requirements. We stated that you couldn't even begin the foreclosure process until the borrower's 90 days in arrears instead of starting it right away. And the net effect is we ended up with a foreclosure process that averages about 3 years. And that's because we changed the process. And so having gone through that process now for about 8 years and seeing the terrible unanticipated consequences of that extended process in the form of zombie properties, we now come up with a new bill, and it doesn't solve the process. In some ways, it makes it even longer. And so when you go down one path and you get really bad results, it seems to me that it would make sense that we try a different path rather than to go further down the same path. And just as an example, this now requires at a settlement conference that we consider short sales and deed in lieu. Well, short sale means not that it's a short time period. It means the bank takes it in the shorts. That's kind of what it means. They sell the property for less than what is owed to the bank. But you can't sell the property until you list it, until you get a buyer, until you clean up every other lien on the property. Because without a foreclosure sale, you don't get rid of the other liens. And so that adds months and months to the foreclosure process. And this bill requires a bank to consider that process or face a $25,000 fine. This bill is going to add 6 to 9 months, maybe more, to our current slow, I'm going to say that really slow process. And then, by the way, if you do a short sale and the bank sells it and takes less than what's owed on the principal, there's another unanticipated side effect, and that is the homeowner gets stuck with a tax liability. Because when the bank writes off any principal, it's considered income by the IRS. It's another unanticipated consequence. So if we want to help homeowners have an opportunity, any opportunity, to maintain any of their equity that they might have accumulated, we want to move this process quickly. If we want to eliminate zombie properties, and certainly my residents do, I'm sure yours do, we want to get these properties back on owned by somebody else as quickly as possible. And the faster we get them resold, the faster a new family is going to move in and help that community and help that neighborhood. And so I'm very frustrated when we've gone down one path for 8 years and it just hasn't worked. and it's created a whole bunch of problems. And so our solution is to go down that path another 6 months or a year or year and a half. And so I would recommend that we take a fresh look at it and actually look at what does work and copy what does work rather than expand on what doesn't work. And I know that sounds pretty simple, and by golly, you know, once I get past 4:30, I'm lucky I'm coherent at all. So thank you so much for your courtesies as I tried to explain why I think this bill just accelerates a bad process. Oh, I'm sorry, slows down an already slow, bad process. For that reason, I'll be voting against it. Plus, it's unconstitutional. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. No J.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the bill,
On the bill, sir.
I just rise to note that for the reasons cited by my colleague just now, and for all the obvious provisions in this bill, the costs of mortgage lending into low-income neighborhoods or regions of New York State, especially rural parts of upstate New York, are going to be devastating to the availability of mortgage loans to low-income borrowers. When we make it virtually impossible for a bank to make money loaning money to low-income borrowers, they're not going to loan money to low-income borrowers. This bill will have a chilling effect upon the ability of young families, of seniors wanting to move, anybody in a low-income bracket to obtain a mortgage loan. And we should not fool ourselves about the health of our mortgage lending economy. We have already seen numerous major banks leave the New York State market. They are not lending to our constituents anymore. And to the extent that we have banks willing to lend money, it is at a dramatically higher cost or lower availability. This bill is another nail in the economic coffin of our upstate New York economically challenged regions. What we are doing here is not improving our neighborhoods or dealing with zombie properties. We are kicking our low-income borrowers, our young families, our people struggling to want to own their own home. We are kicking them in the knees and saying, sorry, but you are not going to be able to own your own home. There are a lot of good intentions behind zombie property bills, and I would support many of those provisions or many of those solutions that have been put forward in this chamber over the last few months, especially by my colleague from Western New York, who has seen neighborhoods devastated by banks who foreclose and then walk away. But this bill takes those solutions to such an extreme that we are shutting down the mortgage lending market. No bank in its right mind would loan into low-income neighborhoods in New York State with these draconian provisions. And we will see a decrease in mortgage lending, a decrease in mortgage availability, or a dramatic increase in the cost of mortgage lending. We are doing enormous damage tonight to young families and others who are low income who want to own their own home. And 1 year, 2 years, whatever period in the future, the economists give us our statistics. Those will be statistics, but they will be evidencing an enormous human tragedy that we're perpetrating tonight. For those reasons, Mr. Speaker, I will be voting no on this bill, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same.
Read the last section.
This act shall take effect immediately.
Clerk will record the vote.
Ms. Weinstein to explain her vote.
While we were waiting for the last few people to vote, I just wanted to mention that we worked very closely with NICOM and others to help ensure that the blight that is affecting so many of our communities around the state caused by these zombie properties, the tremendous expenses to localities, for police and fire and health protections, the lowering of property values because of these abandoned properties throughout our communities will in a large respect over the next, once this bill becomes law, will be addressed, and we will see some revitalization in our communities and homes homes that are now abandoned becoming places where people can return to communities and help revive those communities. I strongly urge my colleagues to vote in the affirmative. I vote.
Are there any other votes? Announce the results.
Ayes 91, noes 24.
The bill is passed.
Assembly 10,742, Rules Report 558, Committee on Rules, an act to amend the election law.